Hi, Angelo John Lewis for the Sacred Inclusion Network. I'm here with my colleagues and my guest presenters. Um, Tom Daly, who some of you have known because he's done a couple of our explorations before. He's sort of a elder statesman of men's work, I'll call him. He's a creator of the Four Gateways coaching method and co-founder of the Inner King training. And a new to me person, Chloe Barrett Page, who, among other things, is pursuing her master's in somatic and social justice counseling at Naropa Institute. She's a certified Four Gateways coach and a Soma source practitioner, which I don't know what it is, and a doula. She's on a lot of stuff, and
mouthful.
So this is 3/4 of the panel of we're doing something that's called Bridging Generations Changes the World. And I thought I'd just give us a flavor, people that are going to participate, as to what we're going to talk about. And this is a little informal, but I'm going to ask some questions for them, and we'll get a dialogue between these people of different generations a little bit. So I guess the first question I have is that Tom, you're a little bit older than me. I think actually you qualify as being a member of the Great Generation. Am I right?
Just barely. I'm 2 years ahead of the boomers.
So anyway, anywhere in there you could choose boomer, you could choose Great Generations, but things happen during your formative years, which I'm just assuming they had some sort of impact on you and how you see the world.
Sure.
What were they?
Yeah, well, obviously the most pivotal one was World War II was just ending when I was born. And that had a huge impact on my life. And then as we got into the 50s, one of the most important things was there was a TV in our house. And that was totally new. Up till that point, it was just radios. We had an actual television. And but in terms of, pivotal events, from there on, the civil rights movement started. It's appropriate, Martin Luther King Day today. Yeah. And, Kennedy got elected, and that was a big deal. I was in college, and then he was assassinated while I was still at the University of Colorado. And that had a huge impact on me. And then, just shortly thereafter, Martin Luther King was assassinated. So there was just incredible turbulence during my early years, and then, into my post college years, the Vietnam War started. And that was a huge piece for me because I had to make a decision about whether I was going to sign up or go to Canada or do something else. So that had a huge impact on my life. And, then after that, the space race, man on the moon, things like that. And of course, the 60s were incredibly turbulent. And, that launched me into a whole nother era of my life. So maybe that's enough for me right now.
And I think when we return to you, I think I would like to you before we talked, you said what does this have to do with spirituality? You didn't quite say it like that, but maybe we can get into that a little bit.
Yep.
And I will just remark, I barely remember television going from black and white to color.
Yeah.
And then I remember color to cable, which is a big thing,
That was a big deal.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Chloe, you were already you had already stepped onto Earth when all this stuff happened, so I imagine the answers are different for you. What are some of the formative events that you remember that maybe shaped you or at least influenced you?
One that really comes to mind is actually, I think it was around when I was in elementary school, and I was born in '90, so I'm in the millennial generation, but really hearing about how there was a hole in the ozone layer and Al Gore and the climate crisis starting to actually be talked about was a big moment for me. And then there was 9/11, which was huge and feels like a big shaper for me in my generation. And then other ones felt like the legalization of gay marriage that happened and how that started to shift conversations around the LGBTQA community. And then Columbine and some of the mass shootings that happened and are continuing to happen in schools felt like really impacted my generation. And I also feel like there's an interesting thread between the 60s and the boomers and then the millennials. And I get curious of like, it feels like there's some common themes within the two generations from the 60s to maybe the late 2000s. And I'm curious about that thread too.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit. I've facilitated things on college campuses, and it's almost like I just get very interesting feedback from younger people. It's like, well, you guys didn't get anything done. I've heard that, but I also feel a kind of like, I wish we had your energy. I wish we had that, thing that seemed to have. Of course, it's history for them, like in the 60s. So I'm curious as to what your take on that is a little bit.
Yeah, I think that I wonder what your all's perspective is, but I do know I've had this yearning for the kind of collective movements that happened in the 60s of like people in the streets and getting together and like mass protests and having that kind of momentum behind it. And I feel like there's been similar almost awakenings socially that have happened within my generation, but because of like computers and technology and iPhones are another huge influence on my generation. And because of that, I think there's been openings into knowing more what's going on in different communities, but it's also taken away and diffused some of that momentum of like people really gathering and showing up together for protests, particularly.
Yeah, the sense of community, I think, is different. That's my sense.
Yeah. Yeah, back in the day, we got together in groups, live and in person. Yeah, that's changed a lot.
Well, I mean, people are still going to like, mammoth rock shows, which didn't exist back then. Well, Woodstock existed.
Sure.
But,
yeah.
I'm thinking of some of these like I don't even remember the name of some of these things that are happening now that people go to.
Yep.
But it's interesting in terms of the social dynamic or the social change thing. It's almost like it's same, but it's different in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. And so, even with psychedelics, I'm just thinking like the rise of psychedelics within the 60s. And there's just some things that feel like parallel conversations happening, but in very different ways.
Wow. We could talk about that for a long time. I mean, to me, it's like Tom and I were there and we were doing things, let's say. And now it almost seems like what is it, like a kind of like a boutique thing or something. I don't really know what's going on since I'm straight these days, so to say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're almost to the point of having, we do have more states now that have marijuana legalized than, more than half the states have legalized marijuana. And, so it's kind of, in that sense, that arc has gone from the 60s to now. It's taken that long for all that to become legal. So
yeah, it's interesting. Chloe talked about gay marriage. That and the drugs, things I never would imagine would ever happen in my lifetime. It's amazing to me.
Yeah.
And even though there's lots of retrograde people around gay marriage, it's almost become normal. Another thing that's almost normal is fluidity around gender.
Mm-hmm.
I know a number of parents that have fluid kids, for example, and if that existed when I was coming up, it was like underground.
Never heard of it as we were growing up.
Yeah.
So I don't want to steal our thunder for Saturday, but I did promise to ask about intergenerational stuff, and I'd like to get to the spirituality piece, but we'll end with that maybe. But so sometimes, well, I'll start with self-disclosure a little bit. I find it easier, generally speaking, to talk to people that are my generation that understand a little bit about my history and a little bit about the depth. I don't feel like I'm unable to talk to younger people, but sometimes, if I'm really to be honest with me, it's like, let's say I'm in a work situation. I may honestly figure, does this person really have the experience to be talking like this to me? I'm listening to them, but there's a part of me which is judgmental. So I'm curious. You all are very friendly people. I'm sure you get along with people of different generations, and you're very good. But I'm sure that there are sometimes it's a little bit difficult, and I wish you would speak to that a little bit and confess like I did.
I think I have a much easier time talking to Chloe's generation than I do the one in between us.
One in between us, meaning?
I don't know. What's between boomers and millennials?
Not much. It's the next one, right?
No, my kids.
Your kids. Okay, right.
Yeah, that it felt like that generation that are my children, that are now in their 40s and 50s are, that was harder for me to talk to them. And I think that's actually a sociological principle. It's grandparents, children. Grandchildren and grandparents have an easier time connecting because, the joke is they have a common enemy. Yeah. So anyway, that's.
How about you, Chloe?
I feel like there is a way where with older generations, I'm specifically thinking politically, of like there can be this rhetoric of like what a mess the older generations have gotten us into. Yeah. And so kind of a sense of like, let's just wait for them to die, to be totally honest. And in that, I can also feel the piece of like the elders hold wisdom, and like, what are we missing in actually not having the conversations with each other and learning from the elders. And I can feel this piece of like, there's some differences in perspectives that sometimes I can be like, I wonder if there is a way to actually meet and collaborate, or if it's just such a big gap that it's not meetable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is designed to be a teaser, this little talk. So I'm going to end with a sort of a controversial question. It's not controversial really, but we meaning me and the people that are in our network, we call ourselves the Spiritual Inclusion Network. So what is this conversation? Why is it important around spirituality in your view? And I know that was not part of our script, but what's your sense of the answer?
Well, I think it just underlines what I said earlier. I think I have a lot of more spiritual connections with the millennials, maybe because of the 60s. I mean, maybe because, drug, sex, and rock and roll was the 60s, and it just kind of opened me up to, a different reality. And I started thinking about spirituality in a different way because I had been raised that spirituality and religion were connected. And when I got to the 60s, I realized there's a big difference between religion and spirituality. And so, I left the religious path and I went down what I would call a spiritual path. So.
Chloe, what's your sense? Why is this important for spirituality, if at all?
Tom and I share a few communities that I feel like are spiritually oriented. And just speaking personally, I find like being in communities with Tom and people from other generations offers me so much inspiration and ground that aren't there in other communities that are more just millennials. And so I feel like it's actually really important to cultivate relationship between different generations within the context of spiritual communities. Yeah, and there's different senses that each generation brings that's really important.
Yeah, it's a two-way thing. I think about the times when I've been fortunate enough to be mentored by people that's generally by older people, and at the same time, when I, like you all have met Ian, I've learned so much from Ian, who's like, what is he, 30 years old, in terms of his enthusiasm and zest for life and things like that. So anyway, our thing is on Saturday, the 21st at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and 9 Mountain Time, which is where you all are. And I'll post a larger description in the comments. And thanks for joining me,
Sure.
Boomer, no, not Boomer, Great Generation and Millennial.
Great.
Amazing. Thank you,
Thanks.
Angelo.
All right, great.
Angelo. See you Saturday.
Yes, we'll see you Saturday.